In the summer of 1947, less than 2 years after the guns of World War II fell silent, the United States government did something that, on paper, made no rational economic sense at all. It began giving away the equivalent of well over $100 billion of today's dollars, not to its own citizens, and not to rebuild its own cities, but to the very continent that had just spent 6 years locked in the deadliest war in human history. That aid would eventually flow toward the industrial base of nations the United States had been actively bombing only a few years earlier. Newspapers at the time, and history books ever since, called it an act of extraordinary American generosity, the largest humanitarian rebuilding effort the world had ever seen. And it genuinely was generous. But when you look closely at the actual mechanics of how the money moved, it was also one of the most quietly brilliant strategic investments any nation has ever made. It didn't just rebuild Europe. It helped build the entire financial architecture of American global power, an architecture that still generates returns for the United States nearly 80 years later. This is the story of the Marshall Plan, told not as a simple tale of post-war charity, but as what it actually was underneath the surface. An economic strategy so effective that its fingerprints remain visible in your bank account, in the dollar in your wallet, and in why? Even in 2026, more than half of the world's financial reserves are still held in United States currency. Welcome to Economy Rewind History. This is the Marshall Plan, and the secret economics of American global power. To understand why the United States made this decision, you first have to understand exactly how catastrophic the condition of Europe was in 1947. Because the popular memory of post-war recovery tends to skip over just how close the continent came to complete economic collapse. World War II had physically destroyed a staggering share of Europe's industrial capacity, including its railways, ports, factories, and housing stock. At the same time, it had wiped out the financial savings, export markets, and currency stability that any modern economy depends on to function. The winter of 1946 into 1947 was brutally and historically cold across Western Europe, compounding the devastation. Rivers used for coal transportation froze, crops were destroyed, and already fragile economies were pushed toward the edge of genuine famine and social breakdown. Industrial production across much of the continent remained at only a fraction of pre-war levels. Currencies were so unstable and widely distrusted that black market cigarette trading became a genuine, documented feature of daily economic life in occupied Germany. People were literally using American cigarettes as a more reliable medium of exchange than official paper currency. This wasn't simply a humanitarian crisis. From Washington's perspective, it was an acute and rapidly escalating geopolitical emergency. A starving, economically shattered Western Europe was, in the assessment of American policymakers, extraordinarily vulnerable to the spread of Soviet-backed communism. Communist parties were already gaining significant political ground in France and Italy, winning substantial shares of the popular vote in a climate of genuine economic desperation. Secretary of State George Marshall laid out the American response in a now famous, deliberately understated commencement speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. He proposed a large-scale American program to fund European economic recovery, a proposal that formally became the European Recovery Program, but would be known to history almost entirely by his own name. Over the following 4 years, from 1948 through 1951, the United States transferred roughly $13 billion in aid, grants, loans, and technical assistance to 16 participating Western European nations. Adjusted for inflation into today's economy, that represented well over $150 billion. The money was funneled into rebuilding factories, restoring agricultural production, stabilizing currencies, and modernizing industrial infrastructure across countries including Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. The plan explicitly excluded the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states, but not because they were never invited. The Soviets were formally offered the opportunity to participate. Soviet leadership rejected the offer after correctly recognizing that accepting American aid would require opening their economies to a level of transparency and American oversight fundamentally incompatible with Stalinist central planning. Moscow then pressured the Eastern Bloc nations under its influence to reject participation as well. That decision effectively cemented the economic and soon afterward political division of Europe into two separate camps for the following 4 decades. Here is where the story stops being a simple, uncomplicated tale of generosity and becomes something far more strategically fascinating. The actual mechanics of how Marshall Plan money moved reveal an economic architecture deliberately and carefully engineered to serve American interests directly alongside its genuine humanitarian purpose. The aid was not simply handed over as unrestricted cash grants for European governments to spend however they wanted. A substantial share of Marshall Plan funding was structured so that European nations would use American dollars to purchase American goods, machinery, food, and raw materials, shipped primarily on American vessels. That meant the money frequently made a full round trip. American taxpayers funded the aid, European governments received it, and then a significant portion flowed directly back into the American economy through purchases from American manufacturers, farmers, and shipping companies. This happened at precisely the moment when American industry, having expanded to enormous wartime production capacity, desperately needed new overseas markets to absorb that capacity after domestic wartime demand ended. None of this was hidden or secretive. American officials openly discussed and defended the structure at the time as intelligent, mutually beneficial economic policy. But it represents a genuinely important nuance almost entirely absent from the simplified textbook version of the Marshall Plan. American generosity and direct American economic self-interest were never separate or competing motivations behind the policy. From the very beginning, they were deliberately structured as the same mechanism operating simultaneously. The Marshall Plan also required participating European nations to accept a specifically American framework for how their recovering economies should be organized, one that explicitly favored market-oriented, capitalist reconstruction over the nationalized, centrally planned models gaining political traction in several European countries at the time. That tension was especially visible in Britain and France, where socialist and labor parties held significant, and in some cases governing, political power. Aid recipients were required to reduce trade barriers between participating nations, move toward currency convertibility, and join a newly created cooperative body called the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. That organization was designed specifically to coordinate recovery efforts across borders, rather than allowing each country to rebuild in isolation behind its own protective tariff walls. This requirement is easy to overlook as a minor administrative detail, but it became one of the most consequential design choices in the entire plan. The habits of cross-border economic cooperation it forced European nations to practice throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, helped create the institutional groundwork that eventually developed into the European coal and steel community. From there, over the following decades, those institutions evolved into the European Economic Community and ultimately the modern European Union. That means the Marshall Plan's influence extended far beyond the immediate post-war recovery, reaching into the entire architecture of European economic integration that followed it. Perhaps the most consequential and most frequently overlooked economic legacy of the Marshall Plan era involves the American dollar itself. And it connects directly to the story this channel told in an earlier video about the hidden economics of inflation and government debt. Before World War II, the British pound sterling had functioned for well over a century as the world's dominant reserve currency, the currency other nations' central banks preferred to hold as their primary store of international financial value. That status had been built during the height of the British Empire's global economic dominance, but Britain emerged from World War II financially devastated, having borrowed enormous sums, much of it from the United States, simply to survive the war. That debt burden fatally weakened the pound's ability to continue functioning as the world's trusted reserve currency. At the same time, an international monetary conference held in July of 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, had already established a new global monetary system explicitly built around the United States dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, while every other major currency was, in turn, pegged to the dollar. That structure was possible because the United States emerged from the war with its industrial base not merely intact, but dramatically expanded and holding, by some estimates, roughly two-thirds of the world's official gold reserves. The Marshall Plan then took this newly established Bretton Woods system and actively cemented it into the daily economic reality of an entire continent. As Western European nations rebuilt using American dollars to purchase American goods and restructured their banking and currency systems under American guidance, as a condition of receiving aid, the dollar became more than the theoretical anchor of the post-war monetary system on paper. It became the practical, everyday currency of international trade, financial reserves, and institutional confidence across the Western world. This is precisely the origin of the dynamic examined in the earlier video on the hidden tax of inflation. A currency that the rest of the world needs, trusts, and holds in enormous quantities as its preferred reserve asset grants the nation, issuing it a unique and historically rare economic privilege. Economists often call this the exorbitant privilege. It allows the United States to borrow internationally in its own currency, run persistent trade and budget deficits for far longer than almost any other country could sustain, and have the rest of the world absorb a significant share of the practical consequences of American monetary policy. That is possible because such a large portion of the global financial system remains denominated in dollars. It's important, in the interest of genuine historical balance, to be honest about the limits and legitimate criticisms of this narrative. Presenting the Marshall Plan purely as a masterstroke of self-interested American strategy would be just as historically incomplete as presenting it purely as an act of altruism. The plan's architects, including George Marshall himself, genuinely believed and repeatedly stated that a stable, prosperous, democratic Western Europe was a moral good worth pursuing in its own right. It was not merely a means to an economic or geopolitical end. The aid unquestionably helped prevent widespread famine and very likely averted a far more severe humanitarian catastrophe across the continent. Historians and economists have also debated for decades exactly how much credit the Marshall Plan deserves for Western Europe's remarkable post-war economic boom. That recovery is sometimes described as the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany or the Trente Glorieuses in France. The unresolved question is how much of that growth came directly from American aid, and how much would likely have occurred anyway because Europe still possessed a highly skilled workforce, institutional knowledge, and industrial expertise. Those capabilities had been badly damaged by the war, but they had never been completely erased. Some economic historians, including economist J. Bradford DeLong, have argued that the Marshall Plan's direct financial contribution to European GDP growth, while significant, may have mattered less than its political and structural effects. Those effects included stabilizing currencies and banking systems enough to unlock private investment and cross-border trade that might otherwise have remained frozen by uncertainty and mutual distrust. European nations were still recovering from years of brutal occupation, destruction, and conflict, and restoring confidence between them may have been just as important as the raw amount of money transferred. This remains a legitimate and ongoing academic debate rather than a completely settled question. An honest telling of the story must therefore acknowledge that the Marshall Plan's precise economic impact, as distinct from its undeniable strategic and political influence, continues to be studied and disputed by serious economic historians. What is far less disputed, and what connects this entire story directly to the world you're living in right now, in 2026, is the durability of the broader system the Marshall Plan helped construct and cement. The network of alliances, trade relationships, and financial institutions built during this era formed the institutional skeleton of what became, and largely remains, American-led global economic leadership. That system included the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both established at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, NATO, formally created in 1949 to provide the military security guarantee underpinning the Economic Recovery Project, and the deepening web of transatlantic trade and financial integration the Marshall Plan actively encouraged. The dollar's reserve currency status, cemented so thoroughly during this exact post-war period, has proven remarkably durable across more than 7 decades. It survived the formal end of the Bretton Woods gold-backed system in 1971 under the Nixon shock discussed in an earlier video on this channel, and it persists today even as its relative dominance has genuinely and measurably declined. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell from roughly 71% in 2000 to approximately 58% as of 2026, according to International Monetary Fund reserve data. At the same time, central banks around the world have been purchasing gold at the fastest sustained pace in decades, alongside growing and increasingly open discussion among policymakers and financial analysts about long-term de-dollarization. Even amid this gradual and genuinely real erosion, the dollar has retained its core functional advantage. That advantage does not come primarily from blind trust or historical inertia alone, but from the sheer depth, liquidity, and interconnected network effects of dollar-based financial markets that no current alternative currency has fully replicated at a comparable scale. The original foundation of that competitive advantage was laid deliberately in the years immediately following 1947, when American dollars, American goods, and American economic guidance flowed together across a devastated continent. Washington understood something that remains just as true today as it was then. Rebuilding another nation's economy in your own currency and according to your preferred economic framework is not merely charity. It is one of the most effective and longest-lasting forms of national strategic investment a country can ever make. So why does a foreign aid program launched nearly 80 years ago still matter so directly to your own financial life today? Because the system this documentary opened by describing still surrounds you. More than half of the world's financial reserves remain held in United States dollars. The dollar continues to serve, even as that dominance gradually erodes, as the currency the global economy defaults to during moments of crisis. And the post-war architecture of American-led alliances and financial institutions still substantially shapes global trade, finance, and security. None of this was simply an accidental consequence of American military victory in 1945. It was actively and deliberately built, dollar by dollar, factory by rebuilt factory, and treaty by treaty, through a program that genuinely saved millions of people from hunger and desperation, while simultaneously and inseparably constructing the economic foundation of American global influence. That influence persists today, even as it continues to evolve. The Marshall Plan was never simply generosity, and it was never simply self-interest either. Like so many of the empires and institutions this channel has examined, it was both of those things at once, operating through the same decisions, because the two motivations were never truly in conflict in the first place. If this story changed the way you think about foreign aid, currency power, and the quiet architecture beneath American global influence, subscribe to Economy Rewind History. Because the most enduring forms of power in history are rarely built through conquest alone. Sometimes they're built by being the only country left standing with enough left over to lend